This video is all about the React component lifecycle. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to describe the three phases of the React component lifecycle. Okay, let's talk about a React component. Okay, so what is a React component? It could be a function, but when we talk about the lifecycle, we're going to be considering the base class component that comes from the React API. So each time we extend the React base class, we actually gain access to what is called the React component lifecycle. So a part of the component API, we have a few methods that we can interact with. So there are a handful of methods that are provided to us from the React API that allow us to tap into the lifecycle of a component. We can gain control over when things happen during that component lifecycle. And remember, there are three phases to a component lifecycle: mounting, updating, and unmounting. Okay? This little diagram helps us sort of visualize what this component lifecycle is all about. If you notice here in the render phase, when we're basically mounting our component, it's kind of like the birth of a in a biological being, right? Every single biological being has a life cycle. We are born as humans, we grow, we update, and we die. There's a lot that happens in between, but those are the three potential phases, right? Now, the same thing applies to a life cycle of a component. And adding a lifecycle into the React component API, the React team has given us the ability to sort of control our software during those different phases. So imagine that before a component gets mounted to the screen, we have some initial data, and that data is built together in the constructor function. Then this kind of weird get derived state from props would be called, which we're not going to cover here at Lambda School. We're going to cover a few other methods that help help you kind of understand this lifecycle. Then what will happen is that awesome render function will get called. And notice that render not only spans the mounting, but also the updating phase of the component lifecycle. What happens with render is that React takes those JSX elements, passes them through the virtual DOM, and then eventually spits them out to the actual DOM. And then shortly after we have those elements on the page, component did mount, if it exists, would have been called. We will be covering component did mount ad nauseum, over the coming modules as well. Then we have this updating phase where, maybe a component receives some sort of new props from its parent component, or the set state function is called, or this weird function called force update is called, which we're not going to get into. But this is all a part of the updating phase. Should component update is another function that exists in this updating phase, and we're not going to use it. So we're not going to need to know how to use it. But what's cool about should component update is if it returns false, then we can stop a render from being called. Because when set state gets called, a render gets called. A lot of these things kind of give us more control. So that's what that's used for. Then, of course, in the mounting phase, or in the updating phase, render will be called again. Then we have a couple of other methods here: get snapshot before update, which is used very heavily in the testing portion of development. And React updates and DOM refs again. So the React virtual DOM takes the JSX elements, any new changes, and goes and says, hey, what's on the DOM currently? What needs to be on the DOM? Let's figure out the path of least resistance to get those new changes to the DOM. And then eventually component did update will be called, which we will talk about ad nauseum as well. And then the bleak and, less flavorful, I don't know how to describe it, part of the component lifecycle is the unmounting or the death phase. As soon as the component leaves the DOM, leaves the screen, this function component will unmount, will be invoked. Okay, so that's kind of how that works. This image is in your training kit, so you can reference it there. Okay, so let's look at these three phases. Remember, the mounting phase is kind of like the birth of a component. Then we have the updating phase, which is the growth. And then, of course, we have the unmounting phase, which is our death. Let's talk about the birth and mounting phase. Constructor function is called and set state data is initialized. Okay, so our constructor function is no different than any regular constructor that you find on a class. React components use that constructor to initialize our state data amongst a few other things. We can receive props and place them on our component as state if we'd like. So through that constructor and through our super method, we can take some props that come into a component and set them up on state if we need that component to control them as state. Render is then invoked and our JSX elements are transformed into DOM elements. After render is called, then we have this one really cool method called component did mount, and it will be invoked. Okay. Now, with growth and updating, any new props that we receive from a parent will trigger updates to a child. So this is what's cool about the updating phase. If a parent's state is updated and that state is being passed down as props, React knows to go and re-render that child component as well, not just the React component or the parent component. This .setState is not directly a part of the lifecycle per se, but it influences it. Any changes to our state need to go through setState. So setState, it's important to understand that any time we update our data, our state will be updated, right? That's how that's our data in our application, right? So setState will call a render method by default, okay? And we can use should component update to stop that if we so choose to do so. But the bigger method that we're going to focus on in updating will be around the component did update phase or method. And then, of course, the bleak and dreary component will unmount. What this method is commonly used for is let's say that in our mounting phase, we basically set up a bunch of event listeners, custom event listeners for window resize or other types of events like scrolls or, pointer events, things like that. We don't want those events stuck on the DOM. So what you would do is you would destroy those event listeners with component will unmount. Where I have done this in my career a few times is I've set up a window resize event listener on component did mount. And then as the user is dragging and updating their window resize, I have, used different widths and things to trigger different, styles and layouts and other things like that. And then once that component leaves the page, I go and I say window.destroy event listener for resize or whatever. So this is kind of a cleanup method that we would use to clean up any work that we're putting on the DOM that doesn't need to be there once our component leaves. Okay. Now, to describe the component lifecycle is one thing. So that's kind of what this is all about, getting you used to going in and diving into the React documentation and reading up on the way that React is built. So I have a link for you in Training Kit for you to follow along. So go ahead and go find that link, and it's going to take you to the documentation for the React component lifecycle from the React.js docs. And I'll meet you over there, and we're going to kind of go through some of these things. Okay, so now that we're all here at the React component lifecycle documentation, we can kind of look and see what is given to us right away from the docs. And I'm going to show you a few cool ways how to explore this documentation. And I'm going to let you also read a Medium article. And then later today, you're going to go ahead and submit a paragraph about what you've learned in the React component lifecycle to your project manager via Slack. Okay, so this page contains a detailed API reference for the React component class definition. So remember, the lifecycle is only available to us on a class component that extends the base React.capital component. Okay, so these lifecycle methods are not available to us on the functional components that we've built over the previous days. Okay, only available through class components that extend the base component class. Okay, so what's cool is React lets you define components as classes or functions. Components defined as classes currently provide more features which are described in detail on this page. So that's why we're going to give you a tour of this documentation. So here is the component lifecycle at large, kind of why they have given us these methods. And all of the methods that are marked as bold are the methods that are a lot more commonly used and the ones that we are going to focus on here at Lambda School. So notice that get derived state from props or should component update get snapshot before update, they are less commonly used. The more commonly used would be the constructor function, the render function, the component did mount function, the render function again in updating, and then component did update, and then the component will unmount. So those are the methods that I want you to be primarily familiar with. And today we're going to focus in the coming lessons, we're going to focus a lot on the mounting phase, okay? Especially when it comes to setting up our data, rendering that data as DOM elements, and then what happens when we use this component did mount. So why would we use this thing? But giving you a tour of this documentation is great because you can go right into that bold method and you can click right there and it's going to take you to your constructor to the documentation about how the constructor is used on the React component base class that you're extending. And this big bold topic will come up. If you don't initialize state and you don't bind methods, you don't need to implement a constructor for your React component. Okay, so normally what we've been doing is we've been showing you kind of how to bind methods in an implicit way. We used to have to bind methods explicitly like this, but there have since come out new features in the JavaScript Next newer versions of JavaScript that allow you to get around this sort of syntax. So if you ever see a constructor that has any sort of event handler methods or any handle change events or anything like that that are bound up like this, just know that we have taught you here at Lambda School a way to get around that. But that's what's happening under the hood with our syntax that we'll get into in coming assignments. Okay. So I want you to now take the time on your own and sort of read through some of the important parts of the React component lifecycle. And how are you going to find those? You're going to scroll back up and you're going to go ahead and click any of these bold methods here. And you're going to just read what the React documentation has to say about them. So go ahead and do that on your own. Take the next 15 or 20 minutes and just sort of get familiar with it. But where we're going to see you next is after you have gone back over to Training Kit and you have found the article that we would like you to read concerning the React component lifecycle methods, because it's broken down a little bit differently just to get you a new perspective. And then you're going to submit a paragraph that goes and demonstrates what you have learned about the React component lifecycle to your project manager. Thank you very much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.